The nurses are striking. The paramedics are striking. The junior doctors are striking. And people are striking across the economy, teachers, train drivers. Everybody seems to be at it. So should GPs strike? Can GPs even strike legally? And would there be appetite within the profession to even go on strike? We're going to pick all of this apart in today's episode of eGP Learning. So good morning, Gandhi. It's strike time, or at least it's time to talk about strikes. This is an interesting episode. We were talking about in our news episode last week about all of the strikes that are going on, and we started to talk about whether GPs should strike in our preparation, and we thought this would make an excellent standalone episode, possibly a little bit controversial. You're looking forward to discussing this topic, Gandhi?
Definitely. And I think important to note for this particular episode, we are by no means legal experts. So we will try and give our opinions based off information we found and from information from official sources, things like the government, the BMA and that kind of stuff. But please remember, we are by no means legal experts in this particular field. Maybe just experienced voices, shall we say.
Yeah, consider this opinion and entertainment purposes, I think, for information and entertainment and opinion. But yeah, I mean, let's get cracking. So how have we come to the point where we're talking about GPs striking, Gandhi? You know, how have we got to this point?
Well, fellow eGP learners and subscribers to the channel will no doubt know that we talked about some of the challenges in general practice. And in particular, over the past few years, we've seen significant changes in funding that happen and significant and exponential increase of workload coming towards general practice, both in terms of the amount of work general practice is being asked to do normally in terms of healthcare population, more complex health issues, more health issues, you know, that kind of stuff, but also that what's called the left shift of work. So the work being transferred from hospital care to the community care because it's actually cheaper to do that in general practice. And obviously then hospitals feel they can focus on more complex stuff, but actually the resources to back that up may not have always flown and followed, as well as the general Gandhi stuff, you know, the whole get a note from your doctor culture that we now unfortunately have within the UK population and stuff, where many other organizations feel that general practice is the way to solve every type of responsibility going. So when you combine all of that with the workforce changes that have happened as a result of a variety of different things, including media progression, changes from Brexit and various other, you know, financial changes that have happened, as well as cost of living increases and various pension challenges we've had, we're seeing workforce go down, income go down, and therefore, as a result of that, people are now just very, very, very unhappy in terms of whether they can provide safe and effective care, and hence thinking about striking.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to summarize, I guess you've talked about all of those increased demands on general practice, increased demand from patients. There's lots of pressure to provide, you know, increased levels of access and access in different ways. There's a lot of change within the profession. There are genuine structural workforce problems with there not being enough GPs and the effect that has on those GPs who are still left in the system doing an increased amount of workload. I think GPs have probably felt a little bit micromanaged, you know, over the last few years, you know, asked to do quite big things and quite big changes at quite short notice with, you know, impromptu letters from NHS England and the Department of Health, quite pushed around, probably actually not treated very well by the government, particularly in terms of media games that the government may have been seen to have been playing with public perceptions of general practice and blaming general practice for different aspects of performance within the NHS that is probably not justified, speaking as a GP. So anyway, so GPs are annoyed, I guess. And actually, this comes at a time when a lot of other professions are facing similar pressures and are also annoyed. I think one thing that a kind of elephant in the room is cost of living and cost of living crisis. You know, GPs are traditionally fairly high or high-ish earners, you know, nationally. So you might think, oh, should GPs worry about cost of living crisis? But it has, you know, it has an impact. You know, when inflation is running at 10%, you know, that has an impact as well. Just looking at
into the viability of practices. So obviously it comes down to how general practice is structured as an independent contract and independent businesses providing care for the NHS. And with the increasing cost of living increase and various other things, and not an increase in income coming through, that makes the viability of those businesses, just like many other businesses that face those challenges, you know, whether they're, you know, takeaway shops or clothing shops, and it's a similar principle. The difference is that general practice cannot increase its costs, increase its income without a contractual agreement from the NHS England, because we don't get paid for the work that we do in the same way that a chip shop would or a clothing shop would. You know, they can increase their prices. We can't do that. So that's where the issue is further exacerbated.
Yeah, gosh, it feels like we're maybe beginning to go down a rabbit hole, but we'll focus on the strikes in a second. But you've just enticed me a little bit further down that rabbit hole, and just to say that there's sometimes a bit of a problem in terms of when we even talk about general practice, because are we talking about GPs and their pay, or are we talking about the funding for the sector, which also happens to be called general practice? I know I'm an advocate for calling us family care physicians now, or and the sector family medicine or something like that, because I just think this is really problematic, particularly in terms of public perceptions, which we will probably come to later. Just one statistic on pay that I wanted to talk about was that the Doctors and Dentist Review Body, so data from the government's own independent Doctors and Dentist Review Body, shows that GP partner income in real terms from 2006 to 2020, so not even up to 2023, and the recent levels of inflation that we've had, with inflation over 10%, but just up to 2020, real incomes are down 15%. So the effect of inflation on incomes, down 15%. GP partner with their take home pay can purchase 15% less stuff than they could 15 years earlier. So that's not a good situation. But
it's important to note that's an average as well, compared to some of the media outlets that tend to comment on the extremes of things. So they will often comment about the high earner practices. And there are going to be some out there that have done really well and continue to do well because of the structural position that they're in and potential contracts and stuff and things where they may be much higher earners. And absolutely, we have to recognize there are some practices that are like that. But on average, they're not. So let's be honest here.
But GPs can talk a lot about the problems, and we can go on all day, about the problems, I guess. But one of the potential solutions that people will raise is, what about strike action? If things are this bad, what about GPs striking? So that's what we'll focus on for the rest of the episode. So Gandhi, I guess it's just worth backing up and just thinking just a little bit about, strikes in general, I guess. So we found a useful article on the BBC to help us understand, about strike action. And so the process for strike action is, so they're instigated by unions. So union membership within a profession or a group of people is really important for their ability to strike. The union conducts a ballot on strike action. And there's some strict rules about how that's conducted to make sure that that is legal. And if a profession with their union or a group of workers with their union agree to strike action, then they have to give their employers 14 days notice, and then they're protected from being sacked for 12 weeks for the duration of that strike action. And then they need to reballot, or there needs to be a process around that. Certain professions can't strike, so prison officers can't strike, police officers can't strike, but other people can currently strike. Interestingly, Gandhi, there's legislation proposed to limit the ability of other professions that are considered sort of core or important professions like NHS workers, to limit their ability to strike, so that they're obliged to provide a minimum level of service, undermining the impact of the strike action, but protecting the general public. The government would stay in balance there. And finally, if you're on strike, you're not paid, for those people who haven't striked before. And according to the BBC article, non-members can also strike, although again, don't blame us if you don't take action based on what you hear. Talk to your union and get other advice.
Yes, it's important to remember, whilst technically you can strike, you may not have the legal protection of striking if you weren't a member of an actual union and stuff. So important to know that slight distinction and things.
This raised the immediate question for us, in terms of how many GPs are actually BMA members, because the BMA is our trade union. How many GPs members? Because just anecdotally, talking to people in coffee rooms and round and about, a lot of GPs that I work with are not BMA members. They've for whatever reason felt they're not getting value, and they've lapsed their membership, which the fee is higher than unions in other professions. Like the RCN, for example. Fee is definitely higher. Have you got any inkling of how many people are members, Gandhi?
Maybe. So just to label that point, so according to the last data, I think 173,000 members of the BMA, predominantly doctors and stuff. There are thought to be approximately 50,000 plus GPs across the country. And on some surveys that we've seen from the BMA, they equate that to full-time equivalents about 39,000 or thereabouts and stuff. So whether that's members that they have polled, and therefore that gives an indicative number of the number of GPs that are members. Unclear. We haven't seen exact data. But I think one distinction and important, and if I'm correct in remembering this, and please don't hold me to count on this particular fact, if there was to be a ballot of action for strike, only one member of the practice of the partnership needs to be a BMA member for that to be acceptable from a practice perspective. So again, please don't hold me to count on that, but I believe from my memory that's correct.
Yeah, I don't know. I've seen articles saying that BMA membership is surging at the moment. You know, they're putting on tens of thousands. You know, sort of month by month. I think as the junior doctors strike issue has wound up. So people, you can join. You know, I guess in the lead up to a strike. I'm not sure if there's a minimum amount of time you need to be a member to strike, but now might be the time to start looking again.
And BMA just for our EGP learners out there, if you were interested to know how much the BMA membership was, it's approximately £39 per month for a full membership as a GP for GP trainees, and for those earning under £50,000 a year, there are concessions based on that. From a general practice perspective, it is different based on junior doctors, so important to be aware of that.
And tax deductible as well,
yes.
as an expense, or as a expense against your earnings. So that softens the blow a little bit. So can GPs strike at all? Because we've got different types of GPs, haven't we? So we've got locum GPs, we have salary GPs, and we have GP partners. There are probably more different types, but those are the main ones. And I guess the situation might be a little bit different for each of those. So taking locums first, I mean, they are paid for when they work. That's part of the arrangement of being a locum. So I guess strike action. Well, I mean, they can stop working and they can stop being paid for work. I guess they have the most flexibility in some way to strike, but they can't do that in a coordinated way, or can they? I don't know. It's a grey area. I mean, they're not bound by a contract, so they don't need the strike protection that you get from, from being a breach of contract.
So however, based on my understanding of the BMA guidance, there are different situations here. So if they're contracted to work directly with a practice, they can choose to take strike action, okay? But that would have to be based on a contracted action. Obviously, as you mentioned, they could...
Is that if they're contracted on the day of the strike? Like
on the day of the strike.
They could then strike. Okay, that makes sense.
Obviously, they can choose not to work, and therefore, by nature, that is a strike action, but they won't be paid for it. Obviously, you won't be paid for it if you were choosing to strike anyway, so kind of a moot point. The slight distinction you need to make aware of, though, if a locum is working for an agency, whilst they may still be able to strike, it's important to note that because they're employed by the agency and the agency is not part of the NHS, they may be in breach of their contract by taking NHS strike action.
Okay.
Do you need me to cover that again, or did that make sense?
People can rewind. I think I got the gist of it. Okay.
So the key part for that comes through, Andy, because the agency is not an NHS organisation, therefore you can't technically strike against them as part of an NHS strike action. Okay. So you would need to be able to, you would need to read your contract, and majority, I would imagine, would say that you can't do that because you're not actually contracted by the NHS. At that point, you're contracted by the agency organisation, who is not the NHS.
I understand. Yeah. So the strike action is defined as an action against a certain employing body or employer or group of employers, and if it's not included or balloted on, then you can't strike against them. I guess that's how it goes. Okay, gosh, complicated business, this, isn't it? I guess the next group are salaried GPs. So I think you'd looked into the issue around salaried GPs, Gandhi. So these are salaried GPs in GP practices.
Yeah, so again, so it's rather interesting because all types of workers in that situation then, because your employer organisation is the general practice itself, you're striking against the practice by not providing work. You're not actually striking against the NHS. So it becomes a little bit more complicated on that basis because the organisation that's employing you is not necessarily the NHS by direct basis. It's the practice. So the only way that, from my understanding, you can strike on that basis would be if the practice itself decides to take strike action, whatever that practice action would be. Even more complicated for GP partners because they're also the contract holders themselves.
Let's get to that in a second. But I suppose the other thing with salary GPs is, whilst a lot of salary GPs use the BMA standard model contract, a lot of salary GPs don't, because there is some freedom to enhance that, or or change that in a way that the employee agrees to.
Yeah.
That's considered desirable to the employee, which means a lot of people don't have a sort of standard contract, or rate of pay, or those things are not standardized, so that complicates that issue further. But so GP partners, so I guess the issue here is that GP partners are not employed by anybody. They're self-employed, or they work in partnerships together, and they hold contracts with the NHS to provide a basket of services to a population of people. So they're not employees. I think there's a few legal opinions floating around. I know there was an article in Pulse saying, "Oh, legal opinion is GPs could strike for a day." Other legal opinions say, "Well, no, they're actually contracted to provide a service, and they wouldn't be striking; they'd be breaching a contract, and they would enter into dispute with the provider of, or the commissioner of that contract, and they would be subject to, they may be considered in breach of their contract and subject to action taken against breach of contract, like fines, warnings, removal of the contract. So it could get quite sticky. What's your understanding of all that, Gandhi?
So exactly as you mentioned, it's a bit more complex because as partners, they hold the contract, and therefore it's whether it's considered a breach of contract or a pause of contract by them doing some sort of strike action, which are slightly different things. And obviously the breach, there's the implications of what does that implications would that have? We've seen in some situations where, for example, organizations like CQC have shut down practices because they felt they were unsafe in terms of offering their contract. I must admit, I've not really heard of many places where breach of contract has been used to shut down a practice or close a practice or transfer ownership and stuff. So I don't know if there's much information around that to give us an idea of what the consequences would be. The interesting thing about strike action, or industrial action as its proper name is called, is that obviously if that was coordinated across a wider area, how would that balance things in terms of then putting some sort of punitive action on contract holders, because you would possibly shoot yourself in the foot by trying to do that to multiple organizations at the same time. And I guess is the strength of industrial action in the first place, isn't it?
It's about collective action, isn't it? So
Yeah.
I guess what we're saying is, okay, if it's a breach of contract, then, and you do that, then okay, what happens next? Well, people have to enforce some sort of action against general practice. But if a lot of people have breached their contract together, and the intention is to enforce fairly and equitably across those people in breach of contract, that can you actually do that? Can you take away contracts from hundreds of potentially thousands of GP practices in the country, and therein lies the potential bargaining chip. An issue, a flag I would raise there is that actually what you've got is individual practices with individual contracting arrangements with lots of different parts of the NHS or ICBs in the future who may take divergent views on how to handle that breach of contract across the country, and probably could take divergent. Obviously, we're in a sticky legal area here. I mean, we don't know how the legalities would pan out, but in theory, they could take different actions. So what happens to a GP in London might be different to what happens in a GP in Nottingham. So there's the potential to divide and conquer here, or even you could imagine within an area, maybe they would take a differential view of breach of contract. And if there's an objective to remove some, I don't know, smaller GPs are not in fashion. This year we want bigger GPs. Maybe those are the ones which are handled more roughly. I don't know. It wouldn't be fair, but the world isn't always fair. But in theory, if you maybe you can, through collective action, really holding the line, and and GP practice supporting their colleagues with persistent action and protecting those who are handled unfairly, maybe there could be successful coordinated action through withholding core services. But there might be other ways to put pressure on.
Yeah, so the obvious thing people think about when they think about industrial action or strike action is not providing the service at all. Okay. And that is a challenging thing for many partners to take the responsibility, because they would obviously take the financial burden of shutting the practice. directly, but also the legal burden in terms of the contractual aspect as well. So then there's a question of how can you, and let's not forget the whole altruistic aspect of the fact that we want to look after our patients. We want to provide healthcare, and by stopping that service, that's going to have an impact on both the individual patient's healthcare provision and also the population's healthcare provision, not to mention the impact on the local area as well. So, you know, how can that work? Well, it's not clear for a start. There's no unified perspective on what would general practice strike action look like, but there are some ideas around what it could take part in terms of, you know, enabling practice to still not be in breach of contract as such. Any that came to mind for you, Andy?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've generated a bit of a list, haven't we? But just to start going through that, I guess what we're looking at things that are not core contract. Anything that's provided under an enhanced service, you know, a local enhanced service or a direct enhanced service, you know, even the primary care network, you know, enhanced service and complying with IIF or you know, GP's role in the support of AORS staff, you know, all of these things have difficulties around them, but not providing some of these additionally contracted services are an option. You know, you'd be in breach of those services. They might take those services away from you, but you would probably still be viable as a business with, you know, retaining the core contract. And, you know, in theory, I guess they might come back and, you know, want those services providing in the future once the industrial action is over. There's all sorts of kind of reporting on information and, you know, and things which I think might be considered outside of core contracts that practices could stop playing ball with. I mean, that's got the ball rolling. Gandhi, do you want to run with that ball with other thoughts?
Yes, as you mentioned, non-compliance in a sense. So when it's down to reporting aspects, CQC, appraisal, you know, there's outside of practice in terms of they're not directly relevant to patient care, although they have absolute aspects of supporting safe care. But actually, if, you know, practice en masse decided to not engage with CQC appraisals, what would CQC do? Would they shut down all practices?
It's a
Bit risky.
It's a tricky situation for practices to be in, isn't it? Because you're going to feel really vulnerable. And then I think you need to then sort of rewind to, so why are you taking industrial action at the moment? Or what's the impact of industrial action? And in some ways it's, you know, it's inconveniencing, you know, customers, but in our case, it's patients so that they, so that, you know, they get not angry or mad, but that's how you leverage support on the government, isn't it? So, you know, by putting yourselves in jeopardy by not complying with CQC, I mean, is the government really going to care about that? Just, I don't know. I mean, ultimately, they have difficulty saying that they have a safe regulatory system for UK general practice, but in terms of really hurting, in terms of strike action, I wonder about those sorts of measures. But people do raise them, you know, as a potential way of causing difficulty.
And I agree. Unfortunately, those are actions that I think wouldn't have a direct impact. It wouldn't be a noticeable one instantly. It'd be an impact that happens in months to years in terms of timeframes and stuff. And actually, that's not the point of industrial action, I guess, in some ways, is to have a direct impact that, as you said, causes a challenge and a change that makes people want to do things about it. I guess some more controversial ones. So not signing legal paperwork. So that can be something basic, such as forms, DVLA, that kind of stuff, and that would have a direct impact on some patients. So particularly if you can't have your DVLA medicals done, then that's going to impact your job potentially and work that you're doing or that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I think there's legs in those sorts of proposals because they don't sort of they're not to do with sort of direct patient care. You know, people are not going to come to harm if you're not going to sign their heavy goods vehicle, medical form. They might come to economic harm, and that's going to cause difficulty. And the people who need them to drive their goods and around in the supply chain are going to come to problems. But you know, you're not necessarily going to cause direct harm with that type of action. So I think those are interesting.
And I guess other ones that include in that life insurance forms, travel insurance forms, and various other things along those lines. Benefit claims forms in terms of personal independence payments and various other types of payments would potentially come into that cohort as well. More controversial one is not potentially signing death certificates and cremation forms. So it's an idea that's occasionally been flirted around because of the fact that actually the patient is now deceased. So technically your duty of care is no longer available.
Is that right? So not core contract to sign death certificates. So I'm not going to hold you to it, Gandhi. But
so it is a doctor's responsibility to sign a death certificate I can't find whether it's a core contractual requirement under the GMS contract.
But the
That's the bit I
GMC
can't
have
find.
we also risk the GMC as well, don't we? You see, from not
Yeah.
following good medical practice as well.
Mm.
So just have to be cognizant of that. I think cremation forms definitely that's not core contract.
Yeah.
So and there are other options to cremation for families.
And that
Very
I would.
unlikely for families though to not.
Important to note that I think that would be an exceptionally drastic step that would be taken, because whilst that wouldn't cause necessarily harm to the patient because the patient's already deceased, obviously the impact to the family and the friends of that patient will be seismic, because of the distress that potentially could cause. And actually that would have absolutely that instant impact that people may potentially want from industrial action. But it is a significant consideration and step to take if that was an action to be taken and stuff.
Yeah, and
But
it's
I
quite.
don't think any of us could doubt it would definitely have an impact.
It would be very emotive, wouldn't it? And sometimes, part of the battle with industrial action is grabbing headlines
Mm-hmm.
that run the right way for you, and these things can, they can play both ways in the media, but
Absolutely.
that would certainly be emotive and headline grabbing if that was part of your strategy.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned list closures.
It's an
So
interesting one. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, I was so yeah, I said, don't you have to apply to close your list? But you said, Gandhi, no, you can close your list if it's unsafe, I guess. Which
So you do,
the
and
argument.
technically to close your list, you need approval of the local area and typically NHS England and stuff. However, there is some sort of buy clause that says that obviously if your practice you feel not to be safe to be open, then actually closing your list on the premises of safety to the rest of your patients is an option you can take. Now, whether there would be penalties for taking that action without the approval of NHS England, that's the part, again, unfortunately, we're not clear on. But, we have heard about things like Opal ratings and that kind of stuff that happen in hospitals, actually in local practices, where they have for that particular day said that they have been unsafe to take on further healthcare provision, and therefore they've had to stop people coming in and saying, actually, you need to go somewhere else. It's akin to that kind of premises that actually safety is important. And, yes, you've got the safety of people still wanting healthcare, but what about those that you're already providing healthcare to? Do you have the capacity and the ability to do that? So therefore, actually, list closures comes potentially under that banner of saying that actually en masse, if every GP practice across the whole country was to say we are going to close our lists on the same day for a couple of days, actually that would have an instant impact for those wanting to register for healthcare because they'd be told that they can't.
Yeah, that one sounds like it's got some potential actually, and might press some of those buttons for people as well, because access to general practice is quite a key issue, isn't it, at the moment? Probably there. I guess the argument would be whether it genuinely is unsafe, or that's the argument you're making, isn't it? Because it's not necessarily. Otherwise, it's breach of contract, isn't it? So
I believe it's my understanding it'd be more of a legal aspect in terms of potential breach of contract, because you're not saying that the patients can't receive healthcare because they'd still be registered with another practice. They just couldn't move practice, they couldn't change practice, and that will have impact on those that potentially moved considerably out of their geographical areas. Could they still go to other parts of the system? Yeah, but they obviously wouldn't receive general practice level care. They would receive a different type of care, which may or may not be appropriate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess at the end of the day, general practice is not an emergency service as well,
Yep.
which I sometimes find myself saying to people. So I guess it's worth just reminding midway through this that this is a hypothetical discussion about GPs striking, and we're kind of exploring all of the what we see as some of the options. So we're not necessarily advocating any particular course of
Absolutely.
action.
And again, we are not legal experts on this.
So those are some of the options that we might have.
One more.
Go on, one more then, Gandhi.
Undated resignations.
Yes. Okay, so this is the practice, and I think GPs in Northern Ireland might have done this at one stage, where you write a letter saying, I'm sorry, we're handing back the contract, or we feel that we cannot continue to deliver the contract and we feel compelled to hand it back for these reasons. But then you don't date it. You send it, but you don't date it. So it's not, so legally it's not you handing back the contract, but it signals a strong intent, particularly if NHS England get lots of these letters that people are really at that point where they will do it. If things are not corrected, then that just highlights the level that the situation has reached. So I think that's how it would have impacts. I think the situation reached some resolution in Northern Ireland, although I can't quite remember what was happening. That was a few years ago. But yeah, how do you feel about this option, Gandhi?
It's basically a game of chicken,
Mm.
for lack of better terms. So, it's asking certain members of the profession to put their whole livelihoods on the line by saying that we were going to resign en masse with the hope that leads to some outcome of change. And important to remember that it is asking those people, specifically GP partners, to do that, because they're the only ones that would actually have an impact, because they are the contract holders. So yes, salaried doctors, locum doctors handing in undated resignations would absolutely have some impact. Locums less so, because they're self-employed, but salaried doctors, if the entire salaried workforce was to do that, that would have a huge impact in terms of workforce provision. That would definitely, but the problem is they would have to hand their resignations into the practice. What would probably have more of an impact is the partners themselves of those practices handing back their GP contracts en masse, because that would require an alternative provider to be found fairly rapidly if they were all to shut on the same premise. Again, it's collective action that would have an impact, but it is asking those GP partners particularly to take on the sole responsibility for the outcomes of that.
Mm. So yeah, so big sort of fairly nuclear option.
Yes. And it's basically a game of chicken.
Yeah. So, and just sorry to run with that, but as you say, it's a game of chicken with one group of people putting their livelihoods on their line, and they might have debts against the income that they would need to continue to receive to pay those, against people who are not putting their livelihoods on the line, who work within NHS England and work within the government. Just wonder who's best placed to actually play that game of chicken in those circumstances. Depends how pissed off the GPs are, I guess. So, but that's hypothetical talk about what could potentially be done as strike action. There's probably all sorts of other things that could be done as well, which people can comment and let us know about. But what would GPs actually ask for anyway? Because GPs are quite a diverse bunch, and what works in one area of the country, doesn't work in the other. There's already a lot of variation in terms of how general practice is delivered, and different models and different types of organizations that deliver it, from federations to traditional partnerships, single-handed, super partnerships, delivery by NHS trusts, all sorts. What would GPs, actually ask for, and could they come up with something that would be applicable in all parts of the country? What do you think?
I think it's difficult, because the easy answer is to say, well, more money. But what does that more money actually mean? What's the number that would make it reasonable? Is it 5%? Is it 10%? Is it 50%? Increase in funding. What type of funding? Is it just GMS core contract funding, or is it an alternative to the PCN-DES? Is it something else?
The people out there saying it's pretty simple. Just ask for core, GMS PMS contract, uplift, in line with current levels of inflation, or set it on a glide path to restore funding to real levels in 2006 or something like that. And, so actually that you could probably find something coordinated to ask for. People sometimes ask for reform as well, don't they? Oh, go on, Gandhi. You're going to come in on the money.
Yeah, I was going to say, but actually, is that enough? Is it just about funding? And actually, if you ask most people within the profession, it's not just about the funding. It's actually about the work conditions that we're facing. That's the bigger challenge. And actually, that requires bigger reform that I think you were about to mention. And the fact it's about bureaucracy and administrative stuff and other kind of changes that need to happen in combination with the funding increase.
So people would say, just to backtrack, that the funding would help a lot, because some of those issues in workforce are, and some of the structural issues are about people not choosing general practice as a career, people not choosing to work, the number of sessions that they could in a week, in terms of people just feeling too burnt out, or people, retiring early and so forth. And actually, money pulling people in, which then improves the conditions. Some people would say that actually the money might help a lot with a lot of these things, and it might actually indirectly help with some of the other things that people are challenged by. But you're going to say, what about reform? Do we actually want to reform how we work? Is it about more than money? And I think that's where it gets harder to know what to ask.
And that raises two other possible reforms that potentially would the profession ask for. We don't know, because no one's actually asked the question yet. But one is around turning general practice into a completely salaried model. This was obviously a mention made by one of our previous Secretary of States for Healthcare, Sajid Javid, in terms of one of the papers he put about our NHS or our people's healthcare. I can't remember the exact name of the document and stuff. But it's a point that's been mooted for quite a few times, that actually remove the independent contractor mechanism and change it to a different type of model that would then allow, in some ways and some perspectives, different types of healthcare to be offered. Actually, would that make it easier for GPs to strike? Yes, it would actually.
Yeah, in the future, it would be a lot easier to strike if you were salaried. But you lose a lot of control of the profession, don't you? Or at the moment, the destiny of general practice is in the hands of GPs, and that's.
And I guess we're talking reform then. The other one we possibly should be mentioning is whether you actually change general practice to a paid-for model in the first place for access. So actually remove the free point of access care and turn it into potentially something along the lines of a Australian or New Zealand model, or one of the other healthcare system models, where actually patients are asked to pay for part of their healthcare directly at the point of access, which would then have an impact in terms of demand.
Yeah, or just activity-based contracting. So just pay per appointment, and if the government thinks that there should be more appointments, then they just purchase more appointments from the general practice sector, and maybe that's a more honest way of running things. People might say so. There's all sorts of things, but it would probably be difficult for general practice to agree on one of on a model. What mostly comes out of discussion with general practice is let 1,000 flowers bloom sort of thing. Allow and encourage the diversity, and and that does make for an innovative sector. So difficult to know, but I think more money would be a bit of a no-brainer, or more funding for family care organizations. Let's not call them general practitioners, because people tend to think that that's money going into GP pockets, which leads me on to my next question for you, Gandhi, which was, do you think GPs are well placed to handle the media battle that goes on in a strike? You ask a lot of people, GP, what's the first thing that comes into your head? And because of years of indoctrination from Daily Mail articles, they'll think fat cat GP, or something like that. I think it's almost ingrained in some people's minds, and I think that sets GPs up to have a difficult time in a media war. I think. What do you think?
I think general practice as a whole doesn't have the people in place to combat the media spin that happens on the same basis. We don't have access to the same organizations. The government clearly has much better ability to spin the media, as well as some certain media organizations themselves seem to have a particular agenda when it comes to healthcare anyway. And many people will be aware of those organizations themselves. But I think, can general practice spin it, whatever you want to call it and stuff? I don't know. I think one of the challenges, unfortunately, we've also, at the same time of the current challenges, seen a change in the way that leadership has been run within the organizations they're meant to represent us. And for lack of better terms, they felt a bit weak at the moment. Are we being appropriately represented by some of our organizations at present? It's hard to see that, because visibly, in terms of the media presence of them, they're not there.
Yeah. It's difficult, and maybe all sorts of reasons why that's happening, but it seems to visibly be the situation. And again, that leaves me, the logic continues to actually, in some respects, obviously the media battle, the hearts and minds of the public is really, really important in terms of strike action. But sometimes for groups of people, it just moves beyond that, and people just think, actually, we just need better conditions just for for the role to survive. I know some junior doctor colleagues have almost reached this stage, really, where they're, well, actually, this is between junior doctors, and the government. And the government have to provide NHS services. They need junior doctors, and actually, maybe it should matter less to us, or we should place less of a tactical emphasis on public opinion than we might naturally place, and actually. That may be of secondary importance to actually just the negotiations that happen about getting the service back running with the government. And I don't know whether GPs are at that stage where they would adopt a similar attitude. Some would, some wouldn't. Therein lies the problem, I guess. There's a variation of positions within general practice. But what do you think? Are GPs pass carrying? Are some GPs pass carrying?
I think some are. I think many people are so frustrated with the current situation that they just got to that point where they are the boiled frogs, or they've already left, to be honest. And that's one of the challenges we're seeing, isn't it, Andy? That more and more of our colleagues are leaving the profession. So that has two impacts. One, we're losing qualified people who are going off to either work in different parts of the healthcare system or not even work in the healthcare system at all. but then that leaves more pressure on those that are left behind to keep the buildings open and to keep the service running, and therefore that puts more pressure on them, and therefore they feel worse, and therefore they do either less work to protect themselves, or they feel burnt out, and they lose the will to care. And you get to that point where sometimes you become so indoctrinated that it's almost like a Stockholm syndrome, in a sense that you just can't see any way out of it, so you just keep going. You could argue, is that the perspective of the government at points? Maybe, I don't know. But I think the long-term consequences of that is that effectively, if you don't have change, it's not going to get any better.
Yeah.
So how do you keep people coming back into it?
Yeah, I mean, what you describe is sometimes people just vote with their feet, and they, they just go, or they work less. I mean, the trouble is that doesn't send like a single signal to the government or a single signal to the public about the severity of the problem. It's just sort of death by 1,000 cuts, and no one notices every individual cut, but the effect is quite dramatic. So I guess what we've established is that this is a murky area, running right from the top of whether it's possible, and how it's possible for GPs to strike, through to how that might happen, and through to what we would ask for and how we would manage the media. It's a very tricky situation, and I guess we'll have to see how things develop going forwards. Gandhi, if I was to ask you, do you think it would happen? Do you think it could happen that GPs might strike in the coming months or year?
So I think it should happen. That's the first thing. And I appreciate I say that from my perspective as a GP partner. So I will be asked to make that decision as to whether or not my practice should remain open or closed, or whatever the impact of the strike actions that are presented to us. I think it should happen. I think, will it happen? I think actually the government doesn't think it is. The reality is, moving GPs to a unified action is, the adjective obviously often used, sorry, the metaphor often used is, it's like herding cats, because we are just so disparate in the views in terms of what we will do, what we're capable of doing, and what we're willing to do, that actually that's what they bank on. And they've been proven right time and time again, because actually there hasn't been a unified action from general practice that's had a significant impact for many, many years. The last most notable one will probably be 2004, when the GP contract came in, and that had some impact in terms of the change that happened. But we're in a different situation, we're in a different place at this point. So like I said, in short, I think we should, but I'm not sure if we've got the people able to do it, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm in a similar position, really. I'm not. It's difficult to see quite how it would happen, given the contractual arrangements. I think I could see some coordinated action that has varying levels of participation in different parts of the country, on things that are additional to the core contract, as we described, and that might have some action. But yeah, it's difficult to see how it happens. I think my answer would be, I can't see that we're there yet, and a lot of that is just structural in terms of how GPs are employed. I think if we were salaried, then yeah, I think you'd be seeing a GP strike. But
however, one thing I will point out is that currently the contracts are held by NHS England. With the changes in the healthcare commissioning services and stuff, of it being delegated to ICBs, that may change things, because actually you take it to a smaller regional area compared to the entire nation in terms of the contracts offered and stuff, and potentially that's a different bargaining way that comes through. So the local areas still quite sizable in terms of ICB general footprint. So we're talking 42 different ICBs. Actually, that might be a different situation, because there may be possible to have more coordination in those particular areas, because it's based around local healthcare service and provision.
That's interesting. Yeah, that maybe opens up some more strategic options for more local strike action against local contracts with local commissioners. That's really interesting. It'd be interesting to see how the balloting would work around that, and if the BMA would just facilitate a ballot in in specific areas against specific employers. Yeah, new territory. So maybe there is some hope in that. And maybe hope is a word to draw us to a close on, perhaps, Gandhi.
Absolutely.
So we'll see. what happens.
Absolutely. And if people are interested in this particular episode, obviously this is a recorded one that we've done and stuff. We would absolutely love to hear your perspectives on this, because actually it's an emotive topic, it's a challenging topic, and it's one that many struggle to understand and comprehend. And actually, if this is something you want to know more about, let us know, and we will try our best to get some people who have better knowledge on this maybe onto it. You can do that by a variety of
That wouldn't be
ways.
difficult.
Yeah, you can do that through a variety of ways. Stick a comment down below. Alternately, you can tell us directly. We still have our SpeakPipe running. So that's www.speakpipe.com/EGP learning, and the G and the P are in capitals. The rest is all lowercase. And you can tell us directly what you're thinking. And if you're okay with that, we will happily share that as well in terms of with other people. As well as that, make sure you do subscribe to this channel, because we're going to have loads of amazing content coming for you as ever. Some probably really good stuff is coming up right here for you. And as always, we will continue to try and tech enhance your primary care and learning. And we will catch you in the next episode. See you later.